Hello everyone and welcome back. So far we learned about weights and biases, we introduced MLflow, we learned about YAML, and now it's time to put most of these things together and build the first MLflow component. So when we introduced MLflow, we introduced it as a kind of a part of a Python script, general library that allows you to run your code and potentially log some information. Now we used explicit runs, defining runs and defining experiments, but that is kind of a more streamlined way. However, in production, in more pipeline-ish way, you want to build components. Each component will serve as a separate kind of a set of tasks that needs to be performed. So, for example, data download, data cleaning, feature engineering, model training, serving, deployment, and so on. And each component does that one thing, explores whatever the functionality might be, and it must generate some file that the next component will use. So for example, if you use download component, you want to download the file, save it, and then use that path in the clean data or clear data component so that it actually provides some clean data or operations on that downloaded data set. Then clean data will generate a new file called clean data set that will be generated in saved so that the next component by maybe feature engineering component might use that to generate features in this case. So let's do just that. In this case, we have our component structure. Every single component starts by creating a file folder. You create a folder and you name it with the name of the component that you should have. In this case, it's a really simple name, my component, but you would be more descriptive. Download data, clean code, feature engineering, training model, stuff like that. Once you create your folder, you will explore and create two YAML files. The first one is Conda.YAML, and then the second one is ML uppercase project without anything as a format of the file. Okay, so just ML project without .yaml, without anything. We just make this. And the third file is the Python file. It must have the same name as the folder. Okay, so that is the structure that you always follow. No matter how many components we'll have, this is the structure. Okay, since we described MLflow as a kind of a one-size-fits-all library that does not rely on any environments. You can use Conda, you can use Docker, you can use Kubernetes, you can use anything that you might like. In this case, Conda.YAML is configuration for Conda. If you define the Docker image for every single component, instead of this Conda YAML, you would define Docker file. And that is the main difference. And the rest of the files will always stay the same. The only definition of that folder or the component will change. Okay. So let's create our first component. Let's start with mycomponent.py. This is a simple file. You have some imports. So MLflow, sklearn, and then you define your function. You can name it whatever you want. It doesn't have to be main. And you use it to run all the files or all the code that you want inside of this component. In this case, we are loading the data set, training, logging some information, so on and so on. It does basically what we did so far, but everything in this condensed my main function. And very important is at the very end, you use this name is equal to main to start the run as we did, and then just call the function. Okay, this is the name. So if it goes by name, my main function, you would write my main function in here. And this is the Python file. So we want to explore this file further since it's what we wrote in the previous tutorials. just for your kind of information, so you import your libraries, you define the function, and then you run it as this, always the same at the very end. Now, this component is pretty unstructured, and it's not a great way to write it since it does basically everything. It loads the data, maybe process the data like in this way, train the algorithm, make prediction, and so on. In the real pipeline, you would create at least two components. So this is what we're going to do in lesson 12. So we'll load the data, maybe save, train, and test parts, and then train the model by referring to our saved and processed data so that we have it immediately in our dataset. Okay. This is about my component.py. Then we have two different files, Conda YAML and MLproject. Let's start with the Conda YAML. The first key is the name, and that is my component. So my component, and it must be the same as the folder name. Then for channels, in most cases, you will have only defaults. The channels part is where to look in the Conda to install basically libraries that we need. In this case, you might have defaults, Conda Forge, and so on. In 99% of the cases, this will only be the defaults, or maybe Conda Forge, as only depends on the libraries that you will install. Then you would define Python is equal to 3 point whatever you want to install. Then, in this case, MLflow, and we want to use scalable or scikit-learn, and that's it. These are only two libraries that we need for this component. The Python is always the same, always the first dependency, so what Python version we want to install. Defaults or channels is where to look to install these libraries, or to download these libraries. And the first one is name on my component, which is the same as the folder name. Then the second file is MLproject. The MLproject is there to serve as an entry point for our component to give configuration to our MLflow kind of a runner.
Now make sure to check out these videos on the right or the full course in the description to continue your learning, and I look forward to seeing you there.